Well, there are several of our early cool season vegetables that can be planted somewhere between the middle of this month and late February and early March in Oklahoma gardens. One of those vegetables that you can be thinking about planting now is the garden pea. If you've never experienced the joy of having fresh garden peas with new potatoes from your garden, then you've missed a real treat. So I would encourage you this year to plant some garden peas if you've not in the past, and of course if you have had those before, then you'll want to be sure and plant some more. We're going to be planting 2 or 3 varieties of garden peas here in our garden because there are some particular characteristics I like about each one of these varieties. But now keep in mind that the garden pea, or the English pea as it's often called, is a very cool season loving crop. It likes cool weather, it has to be fast growing, and so we want to get it out somewhere between the middle of February and the middle of March, as I mentioned, so it can get advantage of that early cool season weather. In fact, if you don't get these peas planted throughout most of Oklahoma by March the 14th, you might as well forget about it. Now, the garden pea is a legume plant, which means that it has the ability to take nitrogen from the air and fix that nitrogen in the soil to help it. So because of that, the garden pea really does best if your soil is a little bit on the poor side, actually. In other words, a soil that's really high in organic matter or high in nitrogen would not be as a desirable soil for the garden pea as another type of soil. The garden pea, though, will benefit from a procedure we call inoculating, or inoculating the seed with the bacteria called rhizobium that actually fix the nitrogen. So that's one procedure you really want to do before you plant your peas. In fact, some of the research that was done early in vegetable production has shown that you can get about a 25% increase in yield from your garden peas if you use this inoculant. And the way we want to use this is put a little bit of water in a container and then put our peas in there so that we can moisten or soak the peas in order for the inoculant to stick. And after we've let them sit in the water for actually just a few minutes, then we want to drain that water off while the peas are still moist then, and put our inoculant on the seed. Now, the inoculant can be purchased in a small bag at the same time that you purchase your garden seed. This is one called nitrogen, which is a manufactured source of rhizobium bacteria, and it only takes a little bit. I'll put about a half a teaspoon with this small amount of peas that I've got in my container, and mix them around or stir them around good so that each of the pea seeds is thoroughly coated with the inoculant. That way, then as we plant our pea seed, we'll know that we've got plenty of the rhizobium bacteria that will aid in the fixing of this nitrogen as the plant begins to grow. Now, with most of our early cool season crops, such as peas, we know that the soil is still going to be cool when we plant them. And so because of that, we may have some disease organisms that attack the seed as it begins to germinate and would interfere with its emergence, and in fact may destroy the seed. So I'm going to also give a little bit of protection by putting some Captan on my seed before I plant. This will help protect from some of this soil-borne organisms that may cause some rot. Now, garden peas are best planted at a depth of about 1.5 or 2 inches deep, and planting them at about 8 to 10 peas per foot. So just slightly more than an inch apart is the way I want to plant these. Now, this first variety that I'm planting here is Early Alaska. Early Alaska is a variety that will mature in about 63 to 65 days, so it's going to be an early pea, and it's a small growing pea. It will only get about 18 or 20 inches tall. And so on the short varieties, such as Early Alaska, you may or may not want to support the peas. Now, some of the taller growing varieties that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes need some support. But since we're planting 2 rows of Early Alaska close to each other here, they'll go ahead and grow up and help support each other. And I want to cover the seed then about 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And as I check these seed, when they begin to germinate in a couple of weeks or so, if it looks like we're going to have some really severe cold weather, I still may want to come in and lightly mulch with straw or with sawdust or some light type of mulch just to give them some protection. But keep in mind that they are a very winter hardy pea, or I should say a very cold tolerant pea, and so you really cannot expect too much damage on them unless we really get a severe cold spell later on. Now, another variety of pea that I'm planting here is the Little Marvel. The Little Marvel is much like early Alaska. Little Marvel will mature a few days later than early Alaska, but nonetheless a pea that's very similar as far as the type of flavor and production that the early Alaska will give us. So I probably would not want to stake it either, because again, it will give it some support. Now you may want to come in though and give some support, such as a trellis or a small wire to these peas, because that will help them grow upright. If you don't, the vines will tend to fall a little bit on the ground. They will tend to suppress some of the weeds, and you won't have much of a weed problem. But here in Oklahoma, if you don't support your peas, then you may also find that we have some problems, particularly with mildew and rotting of the pods as they fall on the ground. A third variety of pea that we're going to be planting here later on this morning in the garden is the Wando. Now, Wando is a more vigorous, more heat-tolerant pea than any of the other two. Wando will get about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, and so we do need some support for Wando, and I'll be putting a support to our trellis on these as they begin to grow. But one thing about the Wando that I like is that it usually will last longer in the season and will give us more harvest than the other early peas will. So that may be a tip that you want to keep in mind. If you want to extend your harvest season for the peas, then you may want to plant the same variety, only one variety, and space those plantings about 7 to 10 days apart. Or you may want to choose some varieties like early Alaska and Little Marvel that will produce peas in 60 to 65 days, and then the Wando, which will produce peas in about 68 to 70 days to extend your harvest season that way. So I think you may want to try some garden peas this year if you haven't before, and as I mentioned, you're really in for a treat in using fresh peas from the garden if you've not had those before. Now, there's still another variety of pea that we want to plant in the garden too, which requires a rather strong trellis support. And so let's go over and plant some of these over one of our trellises that we already have here in our garden. Now, one of the types of peas that's really gaining in popularity the last few years is the edible pod pea. And there's several varieties of edible pod pea on the market. The one we're going to be planting today is the sugar snap. The sugar snap is a really vigorous plant, and it takes a strong support system to support those vines. In fact, the sugar snap gets to be about 4 to 6 feet tall. So I'm going to be planting it next to the trellis we had last year for our gourds. It would really be a nice place for these peas because it is a good strong trellis, and we can go ahead and plant the sugar snap and have those probably matured out of the way before we want to come in this year and plant gourds if we choose to do that again. And in fact, because the pea is a legume, it may put a little bit of nitrogen in the soil that would actually help support the growth of the gourds later on. Now, one of the interesting things about peas that I didn't mention earlier is that you may choose some of the varieties depending on their sugar content to suit your preference. For example, this early Alaska pea that we planted early is a pea that's not quite as high in sugar content as some of the other varieties. And if you'll notice, the seed on that early Alaska is rather smooth with just a little bit of a wrinkle. On the other hand, the sugar snap that I'm getting ready to plant now is a highly sweet pea, and you can notice how wrinkled the seed are on that. And so that might be a tip for you. If you like some of these varieties that are higher in sugar content than others, as you choose your varieties of peas, well, then look at the seed. And the more wrinkled the seed is, the higher that sugar content is going to be. And certainly the ones that are high in sugar content are going to be the ones that probably freeze and process better, because they will then go ahead and retain that flavor. Now, the sugar snap pea that I am planting this year is also some that we bought off of a seed rack that has been pre-packaged. And you're going to find some of your seed this year on the seed racks in a pre-packaged condition. But one of the things you want to be sure and note is that if you buy those off the seed rack, check the date on the back of those packets to see what year they were packed for. This one clearly says packed for 19 and 90. And so if some of these say packed for 1989, you know those are last year seeds, and you may want to pass those up. So I'm going to go ahead now and plant my sugar snap pea. As I said, it's a pea that has an edible pod. It makes an excellent pea to use in stir-fry foods or just simply eaten sweet and fresh off the vine, used in salads or cooked pod and all, like you might want to some of your southern peas or your beans. A lot of people do not like a plant that is quite as vigorous as the sugar daddy, so there are other varieties of the edible pod pea that you may want to choose. For example, there's the sugar baby, which is a smaller plant, and also the sugar bond, which is a smaller plant. They're only going to get about 18 inches to 24 inches high, as opposed to this one that's going to get 4.5 or 5 feet high. So I want to encourage you this year not only to try some of the fresh garden pea in your garden for a real treat, but also if you've not tried the edible pod pea, you'll want to try some of those also. And good luck on those early cool season crops that you're planting in the garden. Other cool season crops such as spinach and onions and radishes and carrots and even some early lettuce will soon be planted. Remember that in southern Oklahoma you can start the planting. In fact, some people have already started gardening in southern Oklahoma, and as we move further north in the state, you may want to delay some of these plantings. Many people ask us each year, because they're new to Oklahoma, what some of the planting dates are. So if you're not familiar with the planting dates or the varieties in your area that are best suited, then check with your local county extension office or write us at Oklahoma Gardening. We'll be glad to furnish you with a fact sheet 6004, the Oklahoma Garden Planting Guide, and this gives you some suggested planting dates. You may also want to check your local extension office or write us and ask us for fact sheet 6011, vegetable varieties for Oklahoma. These will give you some ideas of the varieties of each of the vegetables that you may want to plant in your area. Still another type of pea that we can plant is the annual sweet pea, which is really grown for its showy flowers. Now, the annual sweet pea is an old-fashioned landscape plant, but one that's gaining popularity again in the garden. The annual sweet pea is a member of the same family as the garden pea, but it is one that prefers a little bit different type of conditions. For example, it likes a rich, loamy, well-drained soil. It also must have at least a half a day of sun and also needs a strong support. So I'm planting this one in those types of locations. This is along our compost bin here, and we have the wire here on our compost, so this will give a good trellis support for this pea, but also will help hide the compost. In front of the pea are our roses, and we'll be pruning these roses back in 2 or 3 weeks here on Oklahoma Gardening. But this will make an excellent spot for these peas because we have the roses in the front, then we'll have the tall peas behind them that will have hopefully a very showy array of flowers from late spring on through early summer. Now, one of the sweet peas like to have a cool root system, so I'm planting these about 4 or 5 inches deep and about 5 inches apart, and I'll be covering these over with about 1 inch of my rich soil here, and then as they emerge, we can come in and continue to cover with soil until the ground is level, and this will help suppress or smother out any weeds that may come along as and emerge as the peas begin to emerge. I've also soaked these pea seed overnight because they are a real heavy, thick seed coat on them, and by soaking them, this will help to soften that seed coat and thereby speed up and enhance the germination process somewhat. There are several types of the annual sweet pea that you may want to choose in the garden. We're planting a couple of types here. One of the kinds that I'm planting is called just the sweet pea Spencer mixed, and it's going to get about 6 to 8 feet tall, so it will grow way over this fence and maybe over even on the other side. Another variety that we're planting is called the everlasting pea. The everlasting pea actually is a hardy pea, and it will die back down from the top, but the root system will remain throughout the winter. We probably should get some growth on it again next year. Still, another variety that you may want to choose if you want to grow some sweet peas in the garden is one called Little Sweetheart. A Little Sweetheart is a non-vining type. It grows in a mound or a clump, so you really don't need a support for it, although you still need a good rich soil and about a half a day of sun. So if you've not had sweet peas in your garden in the last several years, or if you've never had them, then you want to try those again this year also as a really showy annual flower in the early summer garden.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.